right? So if you look at these price labels, it was putting in higher lows every step of the way, right? You had it at around $83 right here, and then it sort of tested it, that higher low structure at 100. It then tested it at around 15, or sorry, at 150. And then ultimately it fell back into the wedge at around 200, right? Maybe a little over 200. That's where it ultimately fell back into the wedge. Now, the reason why this is important is because it was when ETH USD fell through this wedge, it went into that bleed right there. Do you see what I'm talking about? You see that bleed. Look at it very closely. Let's zoom into it so you can see what I'm talking about. It went into this bleed. I remember that sentiment was awful, absolutely awful back in the summer of 2019. But do you see how it fell out of the wedge right there and bled? At the end of that 1 month bleed, sure enough, ETH Bitcoin bottomed. Right there at the end of the bleed. Pretty clear, right? See the purple line? This purple line is ETH Bitcoin. It bottomed after the sort of that 1 month bleed from the wedge was over. Now, what's interesting is that if you look at the current cycle, you will see something identical, basically. You have a wedge, and you might say, well, hold on a second, Ben. Is this really the same thing, right? Is it really the same thing? From a quantitative tightening perspective, you can see that QT ended, the light blue line, it ended right after ETH fell out of the wedge. That's where quantitative tightening ended. You see, right here? That's where quantitative tightening ended. That's where ETH Bitcoin bottomed, after it fell out of the wedge. Is it a coincidence that ETH is falling out of the wedge now? And as it's falling out of the wedge, the ETH Bitcoin market cap ratio is nearing the same lows that it bottomed at in 2019. Is that a coincidence? I don't think so, right? I don't think so. So what I think it makes sense to look for here is, as ETH bleeds down right here, right? As it bleeds down, if it follows last cycle, whenever it gets a move back up, potentially if the Fed were to end quantitative tightening, that could very well mark the bottom for ETH Bitcoin. Now, it's really difficult predicting when that's going to be. I don't know when they're going to end quantitative tightening. A lot of people want me to sort of say this is when it's going to happen. I don't know. I mean, they could end it in March. They could maybe wait until June or July. I really have no idea. If you look at the most recent FOMC minutes, it makes it sound like it'll be mid-year. If you look at the chart, if you look at this chart and this chart alone, it could obviously happen sooner. Now, back over there, the bleed lasted about 4 weeks. Is it going to take 4 weeks here? I don't know. It could take longer. I mean, the wedge took a lot longer this time, so maybe the bleed out takes a little bit longer before ETH Bitcoin bottoms. There's a possibility that that's the way it could play out. But what's really eerie about this analysis is that when you look at the low, like the low here for ETH was around 880 or something, which is basically a 10x from that low. And then the next tag of the trend line was when Ethereum was around 1,000, which is basically a 10x from the second tag of the trend line over there. And then the third tag of the trend line was at 1,500, which is basically a 10x from right here. And then as it fell back into the wedge right here, it was in the 2000s, right? It was in the 2000s, which is basically a 10x from where it fell into the wedge right there. Do you see how similar it is, right? I mean, a lot of these moves are just a 10x from 80 to 800, from 100 to 1,000, from 150 to 1,500, and then from a little over 200 to a little over 2,000. So you're essentially looking at the same pattern, just 10x higher, right? We're just looking at the same pattern. It's just 10x higher from where it was. And so ETH USD last cycle, when it fell out of the wedge, and whenever it got a rally after that, when quantitative tightening ended, that's where ETH Bitcoin bottomed, okay? So what I think you look for here is if Ethereum continues this drop, right? If it continues this drop, and then you see a signal in a few months that the Fed has ended quantitative tightening, there's a good chance that that is the bottom for ETH Bitcoin. Now, a lot of people are going to come out and say, can the bottom already be in for ETH, for on its Bitcoin pair? Like, is it possible? It is possible, right? I'm not saying that it has to go lower, but I don't really expect it to go higher. Right? I don't really expect it to go higher until quantitative tightening is over, at least not in a durable fashion. Right? It doesn't mean it can't bounce around, but I just wouldn't expect that until quantitative tightening is over. What's likely going to happen at some point is whenever quantitative tightening ends, it'll likely get a rally back up to the bull market support band, right? ETH Bitcoin will. You see that move by ETH Bitcoin? ETH Bitcoin will likely get a rally back up to the bull market support band whenever quantitative tightening is over. That doesn't mean that it's going to go through it immediately. It could take a little while, right? It might come back down and double bottom and then go through. The thing, though, to remember is that when ETH Bitcoin was doing that, when it was going up on its Bitcoin pair, it was actually bleeding on its USD pair. And this is sort of the hard part that I've tried to tell people for so long, is that, you know, just because ETH Bitcoin bottoms doesn't mean that ETH USD can't go lower, right? It very well could. It all depends on how low Bitcoin has to go. Now, the reason it feels a little bit more likely this time that Ethereum will actually go home and really go deeper into the regression band is because Bitcoin is deviating from its normal seasonality. It is. And what better way to look at that than to just go to the website, right? We have this website, assuming that it actually loads. If you look at the running 1-year ROI for Bitcoin, it's basically been hovering at a 2x for a very long period of time, right? I mean, really going back over a year, it's been hovering at a 2x. One of the things we've said is that the only way for ETH to go home is for Bitcoin to drop itself, right? To deviate from normal seasonality. It's not really realistic to expect Ethereum to go home while Bitcoin just keeps on going higher. But if Bitcoin goes higher, it means ETH USD goes higher, but it means ETH Bitcoin bleeds. If Bitcoin goes lower, it leads to the Fed pivoting from QT, and that doesn't mean they start QE immediately, but it means they could stop QT, and it could allow ETH Bitcoin to ultimately bottom out. Now, if you look at the 2019 move by Ethereum or by Bitcoin, you can see that it came up here, and then it also came off of that 1-year ROI, and it came back all the way down to like a 1.1, 1.2x move. You can see that the 1-year ROI of Bitcoin right now is about 1.354. So what I'm arguing here is that Ethereum is actually doing basically the same thing that it did last cycle. It's just taking place over a much longer period of time. The structure is the same, right? The structure is the same. You have your higher low structure where ETH Bitcoin bleeds while quantitative tightening is going on. You have a fall back into the wedge right here. Right here. When ETH USD fell back into the wedge, it was July of 2019. If you look at the ETH Bitcoin market cap ratio in July of 2019, it was at around 0.13. Right now, it's at 0.17, but you can see just a few weeks ago, it went to 0.14. So when it went to 0.14, it was when ETH USD fell back into the wedge. So you could argue that in 2019, when ETH USD fell back into the wedge, the ETH Bitcoin market cap ratio was 0.13. On the same day that happened, this cycle, it went to 0.14. It's all very similar. It's all very similar. I think the reason why people struggle with this analysis is because it's just taking place over such a long period of time. And a lot of people are sort of getting more so focused on what is the market supposed to do based on what it did in 2017. But from a monetary policy perspective, you can see that this is how the market played out, right? ETH USD bled down into below the wedge, and as it bled down here, right, ETH Bitcoin bottomed out. And then ETH USD went lower, but not because ETH Bitcoin went lower. It went lower because Bitcoin went lower. And then it finally was over and the market was able to trend up again. So this is the way I see it right now. ETH USD will likely continue to drop below the wedge slowly. It's likely not going to all happen at once. You could have some counter trend rallies, but it's probably going to slowly drop below the wedge. At some point, I think that ETH Bitcoin will likely bottom out around the time that quantitative tightening is over. That does not mean ETH USD has bottomed out. What it means is that ETH USD will then just be somewhat slave to Bitcoin USD. If Bitcoin goes higher, then ETH Bitcoin can go up. But if Bitcoin goes lower, ETH Bitcoin can go up, but ETH USD will go down. Does that make sense? Hopefully it's clear as mud, right? But it's all about how do you manage your risk, and that's the way I see it. And if you're curious, like, what do I mean by Ethereum going home? Essentially what happened last cycle is that after ETH fell out of the wedge, after it fell out of this wedge here, it then slowly bled into the logarithmic regression trend line, right? It slowly bled back down into it. And that's why this cycle, I keep repeating it. And again, it's become a meme because it's been going on for so long, and I think a lot of people have given up on it. But just because it hasn't happened, or it didn't happen over here, it doesn't mean that it won't, right? It doesn't mean that it won't. And arguably, that's what's happening right now. And if you look at some of the prior times where ETH USD fell back into its regression band, it would first have a wick down, and then sort of a week where it tries to hold on, and then